Next on our agenda is a presentation from Professor Nafis Alam. He is here in the room, and he is here to give us a presentation regarding point-counterpoint teaching philosophy. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Alam to the committee. Welcome. If you would please, again, just state your name and who you represent to the committee today. And welcome.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, let's do this. So my name is Professor Nafis Alam, and I represent myself. And I just want to make it clear that even though I am a professor with Boise State University, what my opinions are here expressed don't reflect the opinions of Boise State University, nor do they reflect the opinions of any other faculty member within Boise State University. Just wanted to make that clear. I do thank you all for having me and inviting me to speak here today. I will start my presentation by saying that this will likely be somewhat of a dissenting opinion compared to or relative to past task force meetings. And with that, I'll get started with the point-counterpoint teaching philosophy. The problem that I wanted to sort of try and address here is confirmation bias. If we can go into the next slide as well, please. So here we have defined confirmation bias. So we have not seeking out objective facts, interpreting information to support your existing beliefs, our existing beliefs, only recommending things that, sorry, I can't see, only remembering details that upholds your beliefs, and ignoring information that challenges your beliefs. So this would be, just in a synopsis of confirmation bias. Next slide. Professors are human, as we know, and humans have opinions, and humans are predisposed to confirmation bias to validate their opinions. Some professors may unintentionally express their opinions as facts. Some might, by exclusively using sources that confirm their biases. Again, this is not an opinion that it represents Boise State University. I'll probably keep saying that several times over, just so it's clear. This is my teaching philosophy. It's not shared by anybody else that I know of. I want to share one of my biases here. I am a first-generation immigrant. I was born in Libya. My family and ancestry is Bangladesh. We came to the United States when I was 7 years old. Relative to what I've experienced in Libya, which I was probably too young to remember all that, but relative to what I experienced in Bangladesh, and all the opportunities that my family and I have had here in the United States. I have my doctorate degree. My dad has his doctorate degree. My mom has her master's degree. My brother is working with American Express at a pretty high level. So you could say that, that we've been very fortunate. We've had a lot of opportunities coming into the United States. As a result, when I speak about America, I tend often to approach it as though we may be doing things better than we might actually be doing. So there's my confirmation right there, confirmation bias right there. When I'm thinking or talking about the United States of America, I hold our country maybe in a higher regard than I should if I'm taking a critical approach to conversations, that is. So just wanted to share one of my biases with you to begin with. If we can go to the next slide. The null solution, in my opinion, is censorship. I've always been against censorship and banning any ideas and any concepts. And if we go into the next slide really quickly, I'm not going to spend too much time on differential equations unless anyone's an expert on that. We can get into that if you like. But essentially, the null solution and the particular solution that differentiates the two is that the null solution assumes a homogeneous equation, and the particular solution assumes a non-homogeneous equation. If we were to go into the next slide and replace the word equation with population, and then we go on to the next slide as well, what we'd see is that the reason why censorship, in my opinion alone, is the null solution is because it assumes a homogeneous population. Otherwise, I would sort of consider it to be intellectual uniformity. Assumes that members of a population agree with one another. It assumes that students in a university agree with one another. Assumes that faculty in a university agree with one another. And I can tell you that based on my experience at Boise State and at universities prior to that, there's a great deal of conversation. We're never in a room where everyone just agrees with one another. We're having conversations, disagreeing with one another, trying to, think about the diversity of thoughts. In this case, this particular solution would not account for a diversity of thoughts and values. And this particular solution, in my opinion, is designed to be more rigid. If we can go on to the next slide. My proposal is a particular solution, which is the point-counterpoint teaching philosophy. If we can go on to the next slide. Here, the point-counterpoint teaching philosophy assumes a non-homogeneous population, otherwise known as intellectual diversity. It assumes that members of a population disagree with one another, assumes that students in a university disagree with one another, assumes that faculty in a university disagree with one another, and I believe it accounts for a diversity of thoughts and values, and I believe that this solution tends often to be more flexible and less rigid. If we can move on to the next slide as well. My recommendations, and again, no one has to take it, I am just but a faculty member. When we're talking about agreement versus understanding, if the goal here, if the aim here is to reach agreement during any sort of course or any session, then what you might do is avoid the controversial parts of controversial topics like critical race theory. You would increase the status quo, you would stigmatize disagreement, you could potentially decrease intellectual diversity, although it depends on the classroom. You could also potentially divide students who disagree with the pre-existing agreement that you're trying to potentially push, I should say. But if your aim is to teach understanding, you would then embrace the controversial parts, you'd inevitably decrease the status quo, you'd destigmatize disagreement, increase intellectual diversity, and potentially increase intellectual diversity and potentially unite students by agreeing to disagree. This is obviously it's not a surprise. This is the manner in which I teach. This is my personal teaching philosophy. So in any classroom that I'm in, I try to foster an environment, a safe environment, a safe space for differing ideas and differing thoughts. We get right into it week 1, week 2, talking about abortion and 2A and things like that. So, and we approach these topics in such a way that I'm not trying to push my values on anybody else. That's not my job as an educator. My job is to, the question that I asked here is, am I here for my students or are my students here for me? You can go on to the next slide, please. So some of the philosophical pillars of my teaching philosophy: for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So the assumption would be that for every point, there must be an equal and opposite counterpoint. Now, that's not always true, and I'll show some examples of that. I should also mention that if we're going to have points and counterpoints, I have to admit that this presentation by itself must inevitably be flawed. If this presentation is the point, then there must be a counterpoint to the value of this presentation. So my opinion would be that those who believe that there is no counterpoint and no counter-argument to their positions, to their points and to their arguments, might not understand where they're coming from, might not understand their original point and argument. We can go on to the next slide. A few quotes here. John F. Kennedy: too often we enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. How often are our opinions formed without much thought, would be a question, sort of rhetorical. Obviously, it's not a discussion style here. We can move on to the next slide. Benjamin Franklin: if everyone is thinking alike, then no one is thinking. And here I have a couple of examples. This is one example of how there sometimes is not a counterpoint to the point. So if I were to say something like, food is important, I don't think anyone would say, yeah, no, Nafis, you're wrong. But if I were to say breakfast is important, now we're actually thinking, right? We might say, well, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Someone else, like myself, would say breakfast is the least important meal of the day, right? So now we're actually thinking. If we're only confined to saying things that we all agree upon, then are we really thinking, or are we just regurgitating whatever it is that's being that we're being asked to speak on? Next slide, please. And finally, there is no conversation more boring than the one where everybody agrees. Michel de Montaigne. Education is supposed to be fun. It has always been fun. We've been learning our entire lives, ever since childhood. When did it become boring? Also a rhetorical question. I don't know. I personally don't find education to be boring. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. But I think, just creating an environment where it is a safe space to have discussions and disagreements, I think it actually makes for a more fun environment. So in that sense, I do think that controversial topics like critical race theory, as long as they're taught in conjunction with other theories that may be conflicting with that particular theory, I don't see anything wrong with that. We can go on to the next slide, please. Higher education, perception versus reality. Again, this is my perception, this is my understanding of how things are being seen. So, from a perception standpoint, there's an infograph of education equals agreement, and the perception generally in society tends often to be that professors teach students what to think. When in reality, my experience has been, again, I have my doctorate degree, 3 decades of schooling in the field of social work. My experience of reality has been that education is more about understanding. My professors and myself as well teach in the pursuit of understanding, and we teach for the aim of teaching students how to think for themselves, not just to think the way that we're thinking. And if you can see the infographics here, try to get a little creative. But if you look at the one on the right, we see that a number is shown at the bottom there, and there are 2 people on each side. One sees 6, the other sees 9. And I think that's a powerful statement that just because you were right does not mean I am wrong. And I think from my experience with education has been that it's that right infograph as opposed to the left one. I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions. If you'd like, you can go on to the next slide. That's the last one.